Hello and welcome back to the Chargers Check-In. My name is Cecilia and Mike McDaniel has officially signed as the Chargers offensive coordinator. I want to talk about all of that as well as Teair Tart's new deal and the current defensive coordinator search. Mike McDaniel just had his opening press conference with the team and I thought it was very interesting and very promising, and that Chargers fans have a lot to be interested in that regard. So we're going to go over all that and more. Thank you to those of you who like and subscribe. Really appreciate you. And of course, thank you to my channel members who I will shout out at the end of the video. So getting into the press conference, Mike McDaniel, he really struck me as someone who is really humbled by being fired in Miami, but ultimately is on a mission to be the best coach that he can possibly be. And it really struck me how much he seemed to already have reflected on what he can do differently, what he needs to learn. And it's not lost on me that he decided to go and work for a coach who comes from a very different school of thought when it comes to coaching. And, you know, he did talk about how similar they are, and we will get into the similarities between Mike McDaniel and Jim Harbaugh. But he was not someone who, you know, would double down and just immediately move on, insist that he made all the right choices and things just didn't work out. You know, he said specifically that football is very humbling and that he has a lot to learn. He just seemed to contextualize it as a part of him becoming a better coach and a better person. And he seemed very excited to learn from Harbaugh and to support Herbert. And all of this is good news. Pretty much everything he said is good news for Chargers fans. He emphasized catering the offense to the players they have, not forcing a scheme. Also really good news, and I think a good indication of what he and Jim have in common. And this is a great mentality for a coach to have in general, right? You know, no matter what someone is coaching, it's always better to lean into what the personnel can do rather than force people to be what they aren't, for the sake of a hypothetical schematic advantage that can only be realized if the players are capable of doing it. McDaniel also pointed to the need to constantly evolve and change as the players themselves change and improve, and you get the impression that he is talking very granular, like even in the context of an individual season, you know, even across a stretch of a few weeks of games, which I think is really important. Something that we want to see is the ability to make adjustments on the defensive side. That's what made Jesse Minter so great, is how the team showed up after the bye. Similarly, you want something good on offense. You don't want the offense to just be what it is. You want it to be constantly evolving and staying ahead of the problems that defenses present you. And he talked a lot about offensive coordination as problem solving. And if you watch the press conference, I think you'll see someone who speaks a lot like Jim does. The verbiage he uses are like attacking problems, competitors, hungry to win, a lot of the exact phrasing that Harbaugh uses all the time. You know, and he said later he felt like looking at Harbaugh was looking at a taller version of himself, you know, and it makes sense. They're both football nerds and they're both kind of weirdos and they're very authentic and they want to win more than anything, and they seem to both really love Justin Herbert. Specifically, Mike McDaniel said that he's always admired Herbert. He said that when he spoke to Herbert, he was in high spirits, which is really great to hear. He sounded pretty dejected after the loss to the Patriots in the playoffs, so it's good to hear that he is hopeful going into the offseason. He said he could hear the hunger in Justin's voice and he was ready to attack the process of the offseason. He hasn't neared the ceiling of what he is capable of, is what Mike McDaniel said. And he said Herbert enjoys the responsibility of being the franchise quarterback. He enjoys the burdens put on him. And it sounds like the mutual respect is immense. And, you know, I think it's a reminder that Justin is known by his coaches and teammates to be a very smart person, even in the context of quarterbacks, and that the feedback his coaches and teammates always have publicly about him is that, you know, his mind in a football way is on a different level. And Mike McDaniel is obviously very smart and they should be able to work together very successfully, but it was really refreshing. And obviously every football coach who can scheme anything is smart, but it was very refreshing to hear how complexly he is already thinking of the game plan for the Chargers. You know, I got the impression that he already has the bones of a plan for protecting and maximizing Herbert in place. It seems like he is planning for an entire game rather than any one drive, even, like I said, for a whole season, you know, and I got the impression that, you know, Greg Roman was never conscientious about what he was putting on tape. It never felt like he's putting this on tape this week so that next week they come out against this look and we have some kind of counterpunch to it. I never really got that impression. And I kept trying to get that impression. Like I kept being like, oh, this is a good thing for them to put on tape early in the season because this is going to set up a deep play, you know, in the playoffs or whatever. And then as the season went on, it seemed like, if anything, the playbook simplified. which is the opposite of what you want to see. And the way that Mike McDaniel talked about setting up yards after the catch and, not just the immediate consequence of a play call, but, how can you play to a player's strengths? That made me think about Ladd, that made me think about QJ in this offense, who are two good yards after the catch kind of receivers. And his mind goes to, how do plans affect defenses, not just schematically, but in terms of the tendencies of individual positions. Where do they tend to overextend? What can you do to draw out aggressiveness? What can you do to make them restless? He talked a lot about how the quick game makes edge rushers impatient, and that can mean that they do a poor job setting the edge, which opens up bootlegs and reverses and all sorts of things like that. And that it's just a depth of thought that I rarely hear from coaches' press conferences. Reminds me a little bit of some of Jesse Minter's early press conferences, where he seemed to explain his scheme with a similar level of depth. And he also emphasized that Justin Herbert should not be depended on to save the offense. I'm telling you, if you guys listen to this, you're going to like what you hear. He acknowledged how great Herbert has been off script and how he can throw to every blade of grass on the field. But he clearly feels that the previous coordinator depended on Justin Herbert to make the offense work rather than having Herbert's capabilities complement an already functioning offense. He seemed to think that Justin Herbert should be there to elevate a strong baseline rather than provide the baseline itself. He also pointed out that you need a lot of plays that can be run by backup quarterbacks, and his point was, let's make it easier for Herbert, take stuff off his plate, make it so that it doesn't take much out of him to, hit his marks. But I also think it's worth noting that at some point in a season, your backup quarterback will probably play a few snaps or a few drives or even a few games, and it's important that your offense can still function. It's important that your offense does not need its best player out there just to be competent, even if it needs it to be, a top 10 offense or whatever it ends up being. Mike McDaniel is clearly committed to creating a scheme that works for Herbert based on his tape, based on his years in the NFL, which is very refreshing. He's not coming in and telling players how, the best way to win. He is saying, let me look at what you have, and then we will work backwards from there, which is very different than what we saw before. So, he specifically cited that the RPO play that he had for Tua, that he would run all the time in Miami, he had never run it before, at least not that particular look of it, and so he studied what worked for Tua, and it became their bread and butter. And he emphasized that this offense is not going to be the same that his offense was in Miami or San Francisco. It is going to be a Chargers offense based on their personnel and what they have, which is also a good news from a roster standpoint. It means that he's trusting Joe Ortiz to just get him the best players, and then he will optimize from there. On protecting Justin Herbert, he was asked specifically about what he would do differently in that regard, and he indicated that he found it to be a flaw in last year's offense that they couldn't scheme it up so that Herbert stayed upright more. He didn't call out Greg Roman necessarily, but if you read between the lines, that's kind of what you're going to see. He referenced being detailed in the quarterback's launch point, the advantages of having a quick game, especially against the modern lighter boxes defense, and the space that disguised coverages allow offenses to work with in the beginning seconds of a play. And he said that protecting Herbert is a starting point for the offense. He wants to get the ball out of his hands a lot faster, clearly. And that's a big deal. Some of that is stuff we've been talking about all year. That's what Mike McDaniel wants to do. That's why he uses motion so much. Advantages at the beginning part of the play so that you don't depend on Justin Herbert staying upright for the latter half of the play to develop. He doesn't always have to do that. And he doesn't always have to work through all of his progressions. Sometimes you scheme it up so that the number one guy is open. It's a layup. It is not a play that is primarily on the quarterback. It's a play that depends primarily on the scheme and secondarily on your wide receiver one rather than your quarterback every time. That's a very good thing. Obviously, he was asked about Jim Harbaugh. He said the opportunity to work with Harbaugh was too good to pass up. He said that Harbaugh was not being a salesman. He was being genuine. He wasn't trying to force the fit. And, it said it didn't take long for him to know that he wanted to be with the Chargers. He noted Jim's focus on adaptability, the evolution of the game, and the need to find any possible schematic edge. He also emphasized their common interest in the run game and his own history as a run game coordinator. We've talked about that. That's what he was in San Francisco. And he mentioned the benefits specifically of a long drive. If you want to take up a lot of play clock, that's something you look at Harbaugh and you go, Well, every Harbaugh team always has that drive. They always, a few times a year, you see that 10-minute drive that just eats up the rest of the game and keeps a game that maybe shouldn't have been close, really close, and gives the Chargers a win that on paper maybe they shouldn't have had. So clearly that's something that they see that they have in common. In general, I really appreciated how he emphasized being in the moment. He said he is where his feet are. He's not looking ahead in his career. He does ultimately want to be a head coach, but he thinks he has a lot to learn before then, which is awesome. You know, he discussed how he wants to provide value to the locker room and on the field every single day. He wants to be that present. And I think that's a really important mentality. Sometimes head coaches can focus on the big picture a lot, but as a former head coach, he is still, like he said, right where his feet is, being a coordinator, adding value every single day. And I don't know how any Chargers fan could leave that press conference feeling anything less than great about Mike and his plan for the offense. I certainly feel excited about it. I'm really excited to see Justin Herbert in it. I think a lot of Chargers fans who were kind of out on the Chargers after they lost to the Patriots, just because it's like, you know, how many years, how many different coaching tenures can we do this for? And it feels different. It feels very different this time. So that's that on Mike McDaniel. In other news, Teair Tart was signed to an extension, 3 years up to $37.5 million, $20 million guaranteed. I think this is smart to get this done before players start talking to other teams. I think Teair Tart maybe would have been able to get more had he gone to the market and seen what he can do if he was willing to sign with any team. But instead, he stays with the Chargers. They get a new defensive coordinator who we don't know who that is. We'll talk about that in a moment, but it shows that defensive coordinator like, hey, the Chargers are planning on investing in their defense this year. I think it's possible the Chargers still draft a pass rushing defensive tackle. Teair Tart is a great run defender, and I think he's disruptive in the pocket, but he very rarely, converts to sacks, and I think that's something they might be looking to address this offseason. But beyond that, the next moves we're looking for, re-signing Odafe Oweh. I think that's the number one priority on defense. And then we need to figure out what Khalil Mack wants to do. Does he want to retire? Does he still want to play? Does he still want to play with the Chargers? How much interest is he getting from other teams? Things like that. And then what ultimately does that deal look like? But I think it's a good thing to get out ahead of this. I like that Joe Hortiz is not playing around with it. Totally understand that maybe this wasn't the time to do in-season extensions. You can't necessarily, it didn't have a lot of cap room to work with, but now they have, I think after this extension, they have the third most cap space. So they have a lot to work with, and I would expect maybe not Khalil Mack, but Odafe Oweh and some of these players that need to be re-signed fairly quickly, and we will wait and see what Khalil Mack decides to do. So speaking of the defense, the defensive coordinator search continues. I haven't talked much about that because it does not worry me the way that the offensive coordinator position did, because on defense, Jesse Minter, he elevated these players really well, but we also have kind of a lineage of head coaches in the building, right? You have something that Jim Harbaugh has talked about is a pipeline of coaching, so Jesse Minter is going to go be a head coach, but what about all of the guys who have been working under him? And so we're going to talk a little bit about who they've interviewed, who they might interview, and I'm hoping that we get answers this week on who they're going to hire, but it's possible that they want to wait till after the Super Bowl. I don't think it's likely necessarily, but it's definitely possible. So obviously the Ravens hired Jesse Minter as soon as they fired John Harbaugh. It was kind of like, I think they have Minter in mind. They're going to look at other guys, but I don't think you do that if you don't feel like, at minimum, you can get Jesse Minter, the next up-and-coming, really smart, young defensive mind. And I think it was a great hire. Ravens fans do not seem excited about this, especially right when it was announced. And I gotta say, that is because they don't watch Chargers games. They don't know what they're talking about. This is a fantastic hire. Seriously, I don't think there was a better coach out there on the market. Apparently, the process was sped up by the Raiders having interest in Jesse Minter, so I'm glad Minter took this job. And that he is out of the AFC West. He's still in the AFC. The Chargers are going to have to play him, but he's not in the AFC West. You don't have to play him twice. You don't have to compete with him for the division, and you don't have to worry about a Jesse Minter defense with a Raiders team that now has a quarterback. Doesn't mean that the Raiders can't get a good coach, but it won't be Jesse Minter, and I am very glad of that. I've been saying this offseason is a turning point. I think this defensive coordinator hire is going to be a big factor in that, and I wouldn't be shocked if the rest of this video becomes outdated within like 2 days of posting, just because the Chargers have what they need to move really quickly. I think the main thing they're going to look for is someone who is connected to some good defensive line coaches, because the Chargers will almost certainly be drafting either an edge rusher or a defensive tackle in preparation for Khalil Mack leaving, whether that's this year or next year. and the implications that that has on both run defense and pass rush. So we need someone who can develop these young players, including continuing to develop last year's rookies. And I think this hire is going to have a really big impact on the roster construction. They have a lot of free agents to decide on, and depending on the cap space left over, they will look to improve the defensive side to avoid too much of a drop-off with Jesse Minter leaving. I think they're going to want to give a new coordinator a little bit of grace in the form of, a little bit more talent on their side of the ball so that they have a season to kind of figure it out. They will need more than just, day 3 draft picks, players who have been largely forgotten by other teams. But I think this is a really exciting offseason. The Chargers are on their way up. Harbaugh has a chance to revamp his staff after losing Minter, and that much more credibility for this organization that they both want to hire internally. They always interview their internal candidates, and also they ended up picking Mike McDaniel. I think a lot of people are going to want to be on the other side of that, and they're going to have a lot of faith in the combination of McDaniel and Justin Herbert. It lowers the bar for what's required of this defense. I think if you still had Greg Roman, you would go, okay, so they need someone who can come in on defense and be exactly what Jesse Minter is. They need someone who can essentially have this team playing really close to perfect all the time, despite a deficit in talent. Now, I think it's a completely different dynamic, and you have a lot more time and grace over the course of a season to work with. So, starting with their internal candidates, I think their most obvious option is Steve Clinkscale. I think that's someone who, they have been looking at as a potential replacement for a long time. He's their defensive backs coach, and I think Harbaugh has for a long time sent the message that if you want to be a head coach someday, you coach for him. If you want to be a coordinator someday, you coach for him, because he will do everything he can to advance your career. And I think this is an example of him being sincere in that. They have already interviewed Clinkscale. He was with Harbaugh at Michigan. He was a co-DC with Minter in the year that they won the Natty. He was also the special teams he has also been a special teams coordinator. He's 48. He's very experienced with different defenses, and he's a schematic fit because of him being a co-DC with Minter, so there would be continuity in that regard. I am concerned that Mike Elston goes wherever Minter goes, maybe becomes his DC or his offensive line coach. I have to imagine that they will interview both of them, and Minter will probably take whoever isn't promoted. But Minter has been interviewing other offensive line candidates, so it's possible Elston stays with some kind of promotion like run game coordinator, something like that. I also wonder what this defense is like if they don't have Mike Elston, because the defensive line has really overperformed. I think it would be that much more important to get Khalil Mack and Odafe Owe and others back, because they offer a floor on the defensive line that a lot of young players, they may want to add in the draft, can't necessarily add right away. But also, one of the benefits of Clinkscale is that he's been around for a while, and so he's going to have a lot more connections than some of the younger position coaches. And I think that's a really good thing. He might be able to attract another defensive line coach, potentially from the college level. Like I said, he was at Michigan, so there's Lou Esposito from Michigan. There was overlap there, and he was the coach that oversaw Kenneth Grant, Mason Graham in their senior years. They both went on to be first-round picks, and honestly, they looked a lot worse without him in the NFL, both of them. I think especially Kenneth Grant. And sometimes the NFL is just like that. You're going against bigger bodies and more talent, all that, but there's something to be said about the coach that got you performing your best. And he's been a defensive coordinator at Western Michigan, so that could contribute to the coaching pipeline, if you will. But the point is that Clinkscale has connections. Losing Minter is not the end of the world. Losing Elston's not the end of the world. Harbaugh is great to work for. He attracts talent. He has been, saying that they've been preparing for this from the very beginning, which is why I think it's so likely that they hire internally. Obviously, Mike Elston, also an option, but I think it is more likely for him to follow Minter than anything else. So I don't want to spend too much time on that. Although if the Chargers went with him at defensive coordinator, I would entirely trust them on that. I've only seen good things about him from players. So some candidates that they have interviewed other than Steve Clinkscale. First, looking at the internal guys, Adam Fuller, he's a safety coach. He's an option I imagine, that they are going to take a serious look at, because he was a defensive coordinator for a long time. He was at Florida State, including their 2023 season, where they went 13-1, and they had a remarkable passing defense that year. He was there till 2024, and before that, in 2020, he was at Memphis for a few years as their defensive coordinator, so lots of experience. He ran a 4-2 base defense with a hybrid linebacker safety kind of role, so if the Chargers hire him, I think the need for another linebacker increases a lot. He likes having his secondary be a big part of blitzing. You can see that a lot at Florida State. Fuller is very much of the mindset that you attack the offense, you don't let the offense attack you, and as much credit as we give Jesse Minter for the successes of the defense in getting the most out of players. This is a position coach I think deserves some credit for Elijah Molden coming over from the Titans and playing really well. Tony Jefferson, who revitalized his career. They're both outperforming their projections. Elijah Molden was signed to a longer contract. So it's definitely an option. And it's one of those things where if they hire someone internally, you look at that and you go, well, they know him really well. Players already know and like this person. You have to kind of trust that hire. Mike Elston has never been a defensive coordinator, and so that kind of tips the scales in favor of Clinkscale and Fuller. But we'll see. And I think continuity is really important. Fuller is he ran something a little bit farther away from what Minter runs, but even then, still usually a too high shell, 4 lineman base defense, so not that different. An internal guy that may or may not be on Chargers fans' radar, other than the fact that the Chargers interviewed him, is Dylan Roney. He is the linebacker coach, another internal guy. He initially joined the Chargers as a defensive assistant focused on the outside linebackers, and he was promoted in 2025 to linebackers coach, meaning we can kind of look to the edge rushers and linebackers for his impact, and his unit has been very successful. 4th in league in sacks, top 10 in tackle for lost, and run stops at the line. He also oversaw Odafe Oweh's transition into the Minter defense, where he looked like an entirely different player than he did on the Ravens. And, I think that's one of those things that, as much as we give Minter credit for, we definitely need to give Minter some credit. You also go, yeah, but pass rushing is just kind of a 1 versus 1 or 1 versus 2 matchup. Like that is individual performance more so than scheme on the snaps where you're just pinning your ears back and rushing the quarterback. And so I personally give Dylan Roney a lot of credit for that. He seems to be thought of very highly in the building. He was an edge rusher himself at Ferris State University. I think he will be given real consideration. It seems likely that he will interview well. He was a grad assistant under Harbaugh at Michigan from 2021 to 2023. He's been connected for a long time. And I think, if they want to keep him, they may have to give him some kind of promotion, like the pass game coordinator or something like that. They gave him a promotion to linebackers coach and a raise last year to keep him, so clearly they think highly of him. But they've also interviewed other candidates. Now we're looking externally, so even if they end up hiring someone in the building, it's valuable to look at and interview and consider people outside of the building. I think you can learn a lot about where current NFL defenses are and where they're going in that regard. One of the names that they have interviewed is Aubrey Pleasant. He was the Rams assistant head coach and passing game coordinator for the defense. He's been with the Rams for 7 years, started as a cornerbacks coach. He works closest with the DBs. And in 2025, when the Chargers played the Rams in the preseason, Pleasant was the acting head coach for the game. It's something he's done before, something that McVay trusts him with. So clearly he's moving in the direction of leading a team. He has plenty of experience now communicating with both green dot players, meaning offense and defense, being in their helmets. And the defense, they've had an excellent passing defense on the Rams, in terms of takeaways, especially is, something I think about with Minter leaving is this group does not miss an opportunity to get an interception. And that's something that they're going to need some continuity with. In the middle of his time with the Rams, he left to be a DB's coach and a passing game coordinator for the Lions. He was briefly an offensive consultant for Green Bay as well, but he's gotten tremendous success out of his younger players, especially helped develop Jalen Ramsey, Marcus Peters. He was also an assistant DB's coach at Michigan in 2012 and a grad assistant in 2011. That was before Harbaugh was there, so I'm not trying to make a Michigan connection, just telling you his resume. But if he runs the defense like Chris Shula, there's definitely some schematic differences between him and Minter, but he does have a similar emphasis on disguising coverage and simulated pressures, heavy use of cover 3 and sub packages. Cover 4 is the second most common look for them. Post-snap rotations to confuse quarterbacks, all of the modernized defense things that you would expect. It is one of the most varying defenses in the league. And Chris Shula is getting head coaching looks right now because the scheme he brings in is very much in demand. Believe it or not, this is kind of a descendant of the same defense that Staley is a descendant of. But there's a reason Staley was hired after only a year as a coordinator. This is what teams want in this era. They've been very successful at getting pressure on quarterbacks. They like lighter boxes. It's kind of in the same philosophical realm as Minter, even if they approach it a little bit differently. I think this is a great option if they go outside of the building. This might be my number one pick, personally. It's one of my favorite options, and I think it's really encouraging that they're interviewing guys with limited connections to them. And that's not the only option. They also, I hope they take a look at Jim Leonhard. He's getting a lot of attention throughout the league. He's the Broncos assistant coach and assistant head coach and pass game coordinator. He coached at Illinois and Wisconsin. He was briefly the Wisconsin interim coach. Looking back, they probably should have made him their head coach just based on how things have played out since, but, is what it is. As a defensive coordinator at Wisconsin, he led one of the most impressive defenses in the country. They had the third fewest yards allowed per game in program history. The secondary was awesome under him, just constant interceptions, so difficult to pass against. The defense would play very aggressive, which requires excellent cornerback play, which is always something that he was able to get out of his players. So you can feel confident about his ability to develop the young corners we have on this offense. And it also, it begs the question of, do you now, if you hire him, invest a higher pick or something in a corner and try to get some premium talent in that room? He's gotten a lot of interviews. He's had a lot of interest from the Packers, Cowboys, Jets, and a few others. So the Chargers should definitely be considering him. He is definitely going to be someone who's on their radar. Next up, Zach Orr, the Chargers did interview him. He's the Ravens defensive coordinator. John Harbaugh has hired, reportedly, Denard Wilson, who the Chargers did interview for defensive coordinator. So he's off the table, which means Zach Orr isn't following John to New York. He's 33 years old. The defense for the Ravens has kind of regressed under him. For me, this would be kind of a tough sell. Some of it could be a talent issue, but they also took a long time to get Kyle Hamilton where they wanted. Alohi Gilman was good for them initially, but it kind of begs the question, why did Odafe Owe look so rough in those first few games, and why did he have such a hard time developing as a former first round pick? And that's something you'd have to ask, and you'd have to hear an adequate answer for that, because that's a premium player at a premium position, and I think it's a really big deal. You'd also have to consider, are you going to sign Odafe Owe and then bring back the coordinator that it didn't seem like really clicked for him? What is that dynamic there? I'm not saying any one player should determine that kind of thing, just something that they would need to ask about. And a problem with younger candidates like this is they're going to have fewer connections that they can pull from in terms of position coaches, and you'd need that potential Mike Elston replacement. And the defensive line has just been so important to the defense's success, and a new defensive coordinator needs to make sure that the young guys like Kyle Kennard and Justin Aboigbe are still developing. The scheme should be pretty familiar. It's from the Wink Martindale, Mike McDonald's, ideas and disguised coverages, pressure from the corners, safeties, stunts and twists on the line. You kind of know the drill at this point. I would certainly need to be convinced of this hire, but he has the Harbaugh connections, so I think it's worth bringing up because they did interview him. I think they're trying to cover their bases. They're trying to do a really thorough search as quickly as they can. Other options that I think they could potentially consider, depending on how the chips fall in terms of other coaching jobs in the league. Raheem Morris is the former Falcons head coach. The Chargers interviewed him during the 2024 cycle. He could end up being a coordinator for some years before he's given another chance, kind of like your Mike McDaniel of the world. He also doesn't quite have the same hype around him because of his struggles as a head coach, so it's possible that you end up with a defensive coordinator who can stick around for a long time. So, that's one of those things that even if you don't find a whole lot to be excited about with him, the opportunity for continuity is there. He runs a 3-4 base defense, a lot of simulated pressures, disguised blitzes, 2 high safety looks, prioritizing coverage, light boxes, should be familiar. He oversaw some fantastic defenses as a coordinator. He was the Rams DC the year they won the Super Bowl. He was the one who took over for Brandon Staley. And he was also a head coach a long time ago in Tampa Bay. So he brings lots of experience. If Jim Harbaugh does the whole head coach of the defense thing, this could be something he looks at. Just an option. I'm not saying there's much of a connection there, but I think it would make sense, again, in the effort to cover all their bases. And I think it could be exciting to see some stability on that side of the ball. I think it could be a long-term solution. And then he would have a bunch of Rams connections. And it seems like innovation in the league kind of moves through the Rams right now. Next coach I'm looking at, Steve Adegoke. I'm not entirely sure that's how you pronounce it, but that's the Texans safeties coach. I'm honestly surprised that he is not getting any buzz. It's a little bit shocking to me. He was a grad assistant at Michigan in 2021. Harbaugh tried to hire him as a DB's coach in 2024, immediately after the national championship win, I believe. He was expected to join him, and then he ended up going elsewhere. And then so did Jim, obviously. Then last year, Sharon Moore at Michigan tried to hire him again, and he ended up staying with Houston. Probably a good choice. Clearly, Jim thinks highly of him. He was meant to be kind of the Steve Klingscale replacement when they both left. Obviously, the Texans, they don't have any kind of weak unit on defense, no shortage of talent. Their defensive philosophy is our guys are better than yours, so they do not run anything complicated, and usually they are right and they win. 3-4 base defense, cover 3, cover 6. It's extremely effective with all the talent that he has had a part of overseeing. The question is, how much credit do you give for him? If you have this much talent in your room, could that cover for some, lapses in coaching? How much are you actually bringing out of them? But to me, this is someone you bring in the building, see if a new defensive coordinator has a place for him as a pass game coordinator or something like that, so you can consider him in the future. Like I said, I am a little surprised that he's not getting more attention. Another option, another kind of head coach sort of option, is Anthony Weaver, Dolphins defensive coordinator from 2024 to 2025. Used to be the Ravens defensive line coach, so there is a Harbaugh connection there. He was also a defensive end from 2002 to 2005 for Baltimore. He's gotten head coaching interviews. I believe it was Atlanta and Pittsburgh, but most of those jobs are wrapped up at this point, and it is not clear if he will take whatever job that he can get. I'm not really sure where teams are with that. It seems like we're going to see in the next couple days who all is being interviewed by the Ravens and the Browns, and so I'm just not sure that we can say right now exactly what his odds are of being a head coach, but he's overseen some of the best defensive play from the Dolphins in a long time. He runs a physical, tough defense, especially up front. It's hard to run against. In 2021, his defense led the league in rushing defense. In 2023, they led in scoring defense. I believe he'd be high on the list for Jim. We will have to see. Looks like they're interviewing people pretty rapidly, but it would not shock me if Jim gave him an interview. I think John Harbaugh already hiring Leonhard Wilson is kind of helpful in this regard, since he is more connected to John than he is to Jim. 2025 was a rougher year for him. I think that's why he's not getting as many head coaching looks, and I don't know how much of that I put on him, honestly. I think the roster management in Miami was pretty abysmal. I think you saw a lot of players also making what you might call business decisions, which isn't great. It especially seemed to happen on the defensive side of the ball. So he's getting a lot of attention for defensive coordinator and head coaching jobs. I could see him maybe end up taking the Cardinals coaching job or something like that. He could end up being a one-year defensive coordinator. Obviously, that's not ideal given the opportunities for continuity elsewhere, but if he gives you the best chance to win, ultimately you got to take him. So my preference would be you hire someone internally like Steve Klingscale or Dylan Roney, or you go externally and you hire Aubrey Pleasant. If not Pleasant, then Jim Leonhard. I know there's a lot of competition for Leonhard, so we will see where that ends up falling. But I think the Chargers are in a good spot. They have a lot of good options here, and I think, like I said, people want to play for Harbaugh. They want to coach opposite of Mike McDaniel. They want to coach opposite of Herbert, and I think at this point, people know that if you go and coach for Harbaugh, you will be elevated. You will move up if your side of the ball is even remotely successful, because it's not a coaching tree in the sense that he's not imposing a scheme, teaching it to the next guy, and then that guy takes that scheme somewhere else. It's just that Harbaugh has connections and is going to do everything he can to empower coaches and to teach them what it would be like to take that next role as best they can. And I think that attracts talent. And I'm pretty optimistic about this. I still think Klingscale is ultimately the most likely, but I would be very happy with Dylan Roney, very happy with Aubrey Pleasant, happy with Leonhard. And I like I said, I don't think this is as of much consequence as the offensive coordinator position, just because of how bad the offense was last year. So that's that on the Chargers. Briefly, some news around the league. The Broncos fired offensive coordinator Joe Lombardi. Certainly makes you wonder if they're looking to promote Davis Webb so that they can keep him, knowing that he's the quarterback's coach and pass game coordinator. He will be out of the building if they don't. He can get a coordinator job very easily. He is getting so much hype, so much attention for such a young coach, and he's going to explore his options, but I hope he leaves the building. That could be a good thing for the Chargers. A new coordinator would be a big question mark. It pulls potential talent away from the Raiders. It limits their options even further than they've already been limited. And I don't think the Broncos offense has been amazing, so I kind of understand why they made this change. I just think they are going from getting to the AFC Championship to voluntarily having a lot of instability, knowing that they are late enough in the process that the best offensive coordinators are at this point mostly off the board or getting head coaching opportunities. So just something to keep an eye on. The Bills hired Joe Brady. He was their offensive coordinator. So after they fire Sean McDermott, they promote internally. They're expected to interview Jim Leonhard from the Broncos. That's something else to keep an eye on. That's also a big deal because Jim Leonhard would be the logical internal replacement for the Broncos to replace Vance Joseph if he becomes a head coach in any of the 3 remaining openings. It doesn't appear that he's a leading candidate for any of these jobs. He hasn't been reported to get second interviews, but the Browns may soon realize how desperate they are since everyone keeps withdrawing their interest. It is a little bit funny because their ownership, they seem really pathetic. Apparently they're making potential candidates like write essays and take intense tests and stuff like that, like the kind of stuff that those awful like tech startups make their applicants do, like really just insulting interview process. A lot of people are losing interest, and so it's possible that they will lower their standard a little bit and be a little less stubborn and go and hire a really good coordinator to be a good coach. I hope that's the case. I hope the Broncos lose Davis Webb. I hope they lose Vance Joseph. I hope they lose Jim Leonhard. I hope they lose everyone, but obviously they won't. They'll be able to promote somebody internally, but just something to keep an eye on because everything that affects the AFC West is going to affect the Chargers. So thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe if you've liked what you've seen. Let me know what your thoughts on the defensive coordinator spot is. How do you feel about these internal guys? What do you know that I didn't say about some of these external options? Thank you to my channel members. You'll be getting a video on the top edge rushers of the draft in the next few days. I already have it recorded. I just need to edit and put it together. Everyone else will get it in a week, 2 weeks, I don't know. But thank you so much for watching. Really appreciate you being here. My name is Cecilia, and this has been the Chargers Check-In.